Buenas prácticas y tendencias de la industria extractiva.
Implementación de energías renovables en el sector minero y la transición energética. Transparencia en la información ambiental en el sector extractivo.
Gestión y gobernanza de recursos naturales a nivel subnacional.
Mainstreaming. Avances y desafíos.
Equidad de género en el sector extractivo. Cooperación triangular para el fortalecimiento de la implementación de la EIT en Colombia y Perú. Los países de América Latina y el Caribe implementan la EIT y son epicentro de innovaciones y buenas prácticas, convirtiéndose en referentes para otros países implementadores. Alemania, Colombia y Perú implementan desde 2018 un proyecto de cooperación triangular para el fortalecimiento de los procesos EIT en los países y el intercambio de experiencias entre ellos. Este tipo de cooperación permite establecer una relación de tipo horizontal, en donde cada país ha aportado desde sus conocimientos y competencias y ha recibido apoyo según sus intereses. En Colombia, se han apoyado las discusiones sobre pagos ambientales y la implementación subnacional, mientras que en el Perú se ha documentado la experiencia subnacional ya en marcha y se ha apoyado la concepción de su portal de datos. Este proyecto se realiza gracias al apoyo del Fondo Regional para la Cooperación Triangular en América Latina y el Caribe, instrumento del Ministerio Federal de Cooperación Económica y Desarrollo de Alemania para apoyar a la región. Con el apoyo de Cooperación Alemana, GIZ, EIT Colombia, EIT Perú.
Good morning and welcome to everyone to this second session of our webinar series, Good Practices and Trends in the Extractive Industry. Thank you for your attendance and the more than 15 countries that are already connected. I am very pleased to welcome all you and thanks for your time to be here with us. Today we have a very important topic in the resource governance issues. Of course, the environment is really important for all of us. And I'm very pleased to welcome this very high-level panel. Thank you very much to you all. I would like first to say hi to Ms. Elsa Galarza. Elsa, good morning. Elsa has a long experience dealing with environmental analysis in the extractive sector and other sectors. Today, she's the director of the Public Management Department in the Universidad del Pacífico in Peru, and she has served as environment minister in Peru between 2016 and 2018. Good morning, Elsa, in Lima. Also say hi to Lisa Günther. She's working for the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy in Germany, who is leading the EITI implementation in Germany. Good afternoon in Berlin, Lisa.
Hi.
Next to her is Mr. Boris Reda. Boris is the EITI leader in Germany and also a colleague of mine in the GIZ. Boris, good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you very much.
And finally, Mr. Salim Ali. Salim, my pleasure to say hi to you. Salim is a professor at the University of Delaware in the United States and also is an advisor for the United Nations Environmental Program. Salim, good morning and very pleased to welcome you today.
Thank you, Victor. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so we have prepared a very short introductory video. Please, if the guys in the technical desks help me, let's start with that. Thank you.
Transparencia en la información ambiental en el sector extractivo. Una de las principales preocupaciones alrededor de la explotación de recursos naturales y particularmente alrededor de la explotación de minerales e hidrocarburos se centra en los impactos de esta explotación en el medio ambiente. A lo largo de las diferentes etapas de desarrollo de los proyectos y luego en la cadena de producción, se deben observar estándares ambientales rigurosos que garanticen que los impactos son apropiadamente afrontados. Para garantizar la implementación de medidas de mitigación y compensación efectivas, los Estados han establecido requisitos e instrumentos que todo proyecto extractivo debe cumplir para poder operar. En los primeros se pueden mencionar los estudios de impacto ambiental, mientras que en los segundos se han definido algunos pagos relacionados con el manejo ambiental en las operaciones extractivas. Conozcamos las experiencias de algunos países y escuchemos cómo han integrado estas discusiones sobre la transparencia en la información ambiental en el sector extractivo. ¿Qué tipo de instrumentos y permisos ambientales debe cumplir un proyecto para poder operar? ¿Cómo se gestionan e implementan estos instrumentos o permisos? ¿Generan pagos que recauden las entidades estatales? ¿La información sobre estos pagos es transparente y accesible? ¿Cómo se han integrado estos temas en los grupos multiactor? Con el apoyo de Cooperación Alemana, GIZ, EIT Colombia, EIT Perú.
Okay, so the question is a big question, and just to clarify the structure of this webinar, we will have 3 presentations from each of our panelists, and then we will move to a Q&A session moderated by me, and please feel free to ask all your questions in the proper space. We will be receiving that, and we will try to answer as many as possible. We have this restriction on time, but we will try to address all of them. I give the floor to Salim to give us an international perspective, and each presentation will take between 15 and 20 minutes maximum. So Salim, please, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor, and it's a pleasure to reconnect with friends in Latin America. I've had many opportunities to travel and visit, and especially with colleagues in Peru and Colombia and Chile. All 3 countries are very dear to me. So I'm going to try to make it relevant to what you are encountering. The goal is really to give you a macro level overview of what is happening with transparency in the extractive sector, with some particular relevance to EIT, but also giving you comparisons with other opportunities. So this is my contact detail. If you need to reach me later, you are welcome to email me with questions, etc. as well. And also for those of you who are in social media, I try to tweet quite a bit around these issues as well. So under EITI, first of all, it's important to consider that the most recent standard, after a lot of effort, has in social and environmental aspects of transparency. I have followed EITI since its inception, and this was one of the major criticisms of EITI earlier on, that it was only focused on financial transparency. But in the most recent standard, they have addressed this concern. And so now you have these 5 areas, which are in the blue outline, that are covered by the EITI disclosure standard. It's important to also note that the ultimate goal is public benefit. And this is an area which is largely left to the multi-stakeholder group to monitor in terms of how the information that is revealed in terms of environmental and social performance as well can be used by the public. So that ends up being still the responsibility largely of the multi-stakeholder group. And there are some examples that the EITI Secretariat has given of how civil society can use such information effectively, whether it is to launch litigation or to get involved in other kinds of activities that could help with ultimate development outcomes, right? So just to highlight that in terms of some of the aspects of environmental impact, you may be largely looking at data around how expenditure is being spent to reduce environmental impact. So if you look at this last category, as we will see, there could be other aspects of environmental performance which are not clearly required under the EITI standard. So for example, the release of toxic pollutants. This could be something that companies want, but it is not very clear in the standard that they have to reveal, the full extent of that, as it is required by other regulations. So in terms of transparency and resource governance, these are the kinds of the reasons why resource governance requires revelation of information. Investors are becoming increasingly active and needing this. I have been recently working with several investor groups who are concerned about, especially smaller companies, when they invest in them, they want to know what, and they're not just concerned about performance risk. And as you know, sadly, we have had a very serious problem with the mine tailings dams, and this has led to serious concerns in Latin America about the safety of a lot of sites, particularly in Brazil, where we had two very serious accidents. So recently, there was a coalition of investors, a partnership for responsible investing, as well as the International Council on Metals and Mining and the United Nations Environment Program, which got together and just recently launched the tailings review and the tailings standards around that. So this is a major, kind of imperative for investors, and local communities are the ones who suffer the most. So you want transparency for them as well, and to have civil society as the interface. But now there is also growing interest in the general public internationally about performance, because minerals are considered in many ways a global how we transition to clean energy sources, how we think about our future trajectory and sustainability has a lot to do with the general public. So, for example, the United Nations Environment has launched a resolution in the last session last year where they actually want mineral resource governance to be at the international agenda. And to see now in the next 6 months, there is a consultation process which is undergoing to consider what can be a mechanism for international mineral governance. So this is something not just domestic, but it's reaching that level, and especially environmental governance of mineral resource. Of course, governments, ministries, and departments have a need for them. The legislatures, both the bureaucracy and the legislatures, the people who make the laws, they also want to have this information, and that translates to provincial and local government. Now, this is an effort that was made some years ago. There was an entity called the Natural Resource, which later you have data, which is disclosed. That can be a very important mechanism by which communities can also have access where projects have initially been started and then stopped many times. In Peru, many such cycles. It start, stop, and that can be a big concern for communities. So having better data on geoscience and pricing and what decisions go into whether a project is going to go ahead is very important. The other has to do with the licensing and investment agreement,
¿Ah?
getting a good deal in terms
¿Para
of
hablar en español?
whether or not that agreement has all of those different
Yo lo veo que
community
sale acá.
benefits, environmental engagement clearly noted as well. And then managing the revenues. How are the resources going to go into different community funds? How are they going to be further leveraged and managed? That's what traditionally EITI has been best at doing, right? That's been the focus until this most recent standard. And then public expenditure in terms of how that money is used, that's coming into this new standard much more so in terms of whether that investment is happening in much more sustainable trajectories. One of the major concerns has been that the investment
¿Ahora volvió?
which comes from resource rents, it goes into the central coffers, the central government, and there isn't the level of benefit that is seen in the community mining occurred. And that has changed through recent laws. I know in many countries, including in Peru and Chile, some of the recent legal reforms have made it a requirement that certain amount of money has to go into the communities where the extraction has occurred. Now, how has EITI helped with sustainable development overall? This diagram lays out what happens. You have the extractive industries, the government, you have revenue disclosure, and you have this accountability process. But the key issue is really this arrow here, which is from effective distribution to policy implementation. And the EITI itself is not really able to this part. This is left to the civil society and the local governments to pursue this, whether they consensus processes or they do it through litigation. And this is what I think is really important is the EITI is to an end. It is not an end in itself. It provides you the tool, but it is not a regulatory mechanism. It's providing you the information so you can use it for more effective action. And that's what I think needs to be much more clearly delineated. Now, I wanted to also alert the audience that there are other initiatives for environmental transparency, which are very important for you to keep track of. One of the earliest and most significant one is the Global Reporting Initiative. This was originally launched as a business effort where companies agreed that they wanted to report information about their performance so that differentiate them performers versus bad performers. And the Global Reporting Initiative has matured quite a bit. And they have a very detailed website. I was going to show you the website as well, but I think switching back and forth will take too much time. But if you just Google the Global Reporting Initiative, you will find the website. Most recently, they have started launching sector standards, not just total corporate standards, but for each sector. So they are going through a process for the oil and gas industry right now. They are going through a consultation on the oil and gas industry's reporting standard. What are the different criteria which the oil and gas industry should be reporting? So what I would urge the communities to do is the multi-stakeholder groups should consider in Latin America, what are the companies who have signed on to the Global Reporting Initiative? What are they disclosing through the GRI reports? And how can they improve the reporting for the EITI that's happening? And urge more companies to also join such reporting standards, because the GRI is much more detailed in terms of the kind of reporting than the EITI has stipulated. The EITI environmental disclosures are very broad right now. And so I think for the communities to really benefit, they need to go into the specifics, which can come from the GRI type of disclosures. There are domestic laws also which are requiring more environmental disclosure. The European Union has environmental disclosure regulations, many of them, and just last year they actually went through a process of consolidating them. So if you have European companies operating in Latin America, which you do have in many cases, they may well be subject to European Union environmental disclosure standards. So having that as also part of your toolkit will be very important. And the Council of Europe has just last year consolidated them and made them more efficient. So I'm sure our German friends know far more about this than I do, but this is an important mechanism to drive the agenda forward. Also, when I'm in Latin America and Africa, I often hear about Chinese investment. And generally, there are concerns raised about performance in some cases of Chinese companies, but there are also many misunderstandings. A lot of Chinese regulations also require disclosure in China of performance of Chinese companies, both in the country and overseas. Increasingly, China has become much more vigilant. And this is a website I provided you, which is for an organization that is based in China that has very up-to-date information of companies who have violated their environmental regulations in China. Many of those are multinationals, even state-owned companies. If they have done so, they are listed there. This was an initiative. Saying this is how much is being emitted. So you can actually track, and there are many Chinese civil society groups which have used this data to launch litigation against local governments. So I would say that this is a resource which civil society groups, even in Latin America, can use, because there is much more Chinese investment happening in Latin America. And this is a good thing that, you have a lot of different countries who can compete and hopefully do it in a positive way so that you get. So keep that in mind. In the United States, we also have a law called the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. Under the EPCRA law, there is the requirement for a releases inventory. Every year companies, and this is true of all companies, they are required to release data on their pollution discharges and whether those pollution discharges meet certain standards or not. And then civil society groups have the opportunity to review them. Similar laws may be also forthcoming in parts of Latin America. But that has been an important tool whereby that disclosure requirement has empowered civil society to move forward. So that's all from me. Just wanted to give you that quick primer. I look forward to hearing from the other speakers and to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salim. Okay, maybe just to remember, don't forget to ask your question or comments. We will be receiving that. And in the later session, we will be receiving and answering as much as possible. Thank you to Mr. Freile and Francisco Paris until now. Thank you for your comments and your questions. We will be coming back on that. Now I would like to welcome again, Miss Elsa Galarza. Elsa, you have been really in deep connected in these discussions in Peru. You have been in charge of the environmental ministry, so we are pretty excited to have you on board and to hear your experience with us. Thank you very much. I just remembered that we have the simultaneous translation available for the audience. Please feel free to choose the language of your preference between English.
Thank you, Victor. I want to know if you hear me correctly and if you see my presentation.
We hear you, but until now I don't see your presentation.
Okay, let me see what happens. Okay, let's try again. Sorry for that.
No problem.
¿Escuchamos? Sí.
Now?
Yeah, we are looking at your screen.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to share this conversation with you and all the audience. I will be speaking in Spanish, if you will, just to keep it in time. Okay.
As Victor said it earlier, I'd like to share with you in this presentation my own personal experience in the world of access to environmental information with relation to the extractive industries. In order to do that, I have selected basically two institutions that are key in relation to the extractive industries, which are the Agency of Environmental Certification, which is SENACE, as well as OEFA, which is the entity responsible for the supervision and enforcement once the operations are ongoing. I will make some comments regarding the financing and I will make a couple of contributions to the roadmap. First of all, I would like to make 3 points as a means of context for you. Without a doubt, whenever we talk about extractive industries in the Peruvian economy as well as in many countries in Latin America, we are talking about a very important sector for the economic growth and for the development of the countries overall. In Peru, these industries account for 22.2% of the GDP, including mining, hydrocarbons, fishing, agricultural activities, as well as the primary industry. And when it comes to the exports, the same sectors account for close to 90% of the exports of the country overall. Therefore, without a doubt, it's a very important topic that we are addressing today. Without a doubt, and as Salim said it himself, during the latest years there has been progress, in my opinion, in how we address the issue of transparency, information, citizen participation, etc. Without a doubt, the system definitely has room for improvement, but if we were to look back 20 years ago, there will be major differences. So I prefer to see the half full glass instead of the half empty glass because I believe we are on the right track. For instance, the fact that we have a standardized transparency web portal for all the sectors already generates the right setting to promote more information, more participation, etc. etc. Without a doubt, the recent ratification of the agreement of Escazú once again puts the topic on the priority of our agenda, and we have to take that opportunity and we have to use this meeting as well to draw some elements to move forward with our work. The third element of the context has to do with knowing those environmental problems that are more general or overarching problems. I have listed 5 points here, but the first two have to do with the time frames. And I used to say that there is this myth that says that economic development cannot go hand in hand with the environmental issues, that caring for the environment cannot go hand in hand with the extractive industries. And I think the problem is a problem of time frames, because usually the environmental benefits happen in the long run and they are general benefits. They cannot be allocated to a certain company. However, the costs of making environmental improvements are definitely allocated to a certain sector or to a certain company, as I'm sure you all know, and they do require immediate action. So, on one hand, we have high costs of of the interventions, but the benefits will only be seen in the long run. Also, the environmental issue is not something simple to understand. There are many cause effect relationships that are not simple to understand, they are highly technical. Therefore, many times the regulation becomes so specific that it prevents the companies from innovating and it prevents them from figuring out the most financially sensible manner of solving these problems. So, in addition to all of this, I believe that there are some environmental issues that have no market whatsoever and that increases the complexity. Having said that, I would like to address the topic of information considering two key areas. The first one has to do with the generation of information itself, and that lies within the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment, but also is the responsibility of other sectors. I'm sure that you know that the environmental issues are cross sectional issues, but something that's cross sectional is very difficult to implement. But actually, the Ministry of Environment has a key role to play, but this is definitely a responsibility of other sectors, both in terms of information and management. The second area has to do with having access to public information. And that's when we talk about the different processes that are in place. And I will address the two entities that I mentioned earlier. Now, if we address the topic of environmental information, this is very important to mention. I conduct research myself and have suffered the lack of information. I was looking back in time when I was preparing my presentation. 15 years ago, more or less, I had to pay to have access to information, or I had to go around asking for information that many times was just not available. I worked in the area of fishing and I wanted to know the volume of extraction, for instance, and that was information that was not available at all, and nowadays it is. Regarding the environmental issues in particular, there is a national system of information in place where, of course, there are references to the status of the environment. However, within that system, there are several systems that I have listed on the screen. There's one for forestry, there's one for solid waste, one for emissions, for risk of disasters, etc., etc. And I believe that now we are at a point where we have a surplus of information which is highly complex, highly diverse, and it causes problems as well. And I have tried to look at this from two approaches. First, we have to address the supply, and secondly, the demand for information. When it comes to the supply of information, we need to improve our capabilities. We need to better organize the systems that we already have in place, and we need to be able to maintain the records up to date without errors. For instance, this one time we conducted this work to try to figure out how much or how many resources the state had used to address climate change. So we went to the Ministry of Finance, to their database, which is very good. And when we tried to look for that information, there was no information whatsoever. And the problem was a problem of keeping record, because those that were responsible for entering the data, they weren't even sure what was climate change or what could be represented as climate change instead of development, for instance. So there are still many gaps that need to be closed in order to have the right supply of information, which is consistent, which is permanent, that lasts in time, and that is useful as well. Another topic that we don't hear much about is the demand for information. Who wants this information? Who uses this information? And this has to do with knowing very well how you will present that information to your target audience. Because, of course, you need certain information for decision makers. That information needs to be based on scientific evidence without a doubt. I had an experience when I was conducting work related to the environmental indicators of water, oil, and air. And we would say, okay, the air monitoring stations are reporting, right? They're not issuing complete reports. Yes, okay, but there are several institutions measuring the same. How about we create a network? Nope, can't do that because the information is taken with different equipments that have been calibrated differently. Therefore, the information that they obtain is not information that can be compared. So just take a look at that. It's a very small example. And something else, when it comes to decision making, you need to have assessments of impact to know whether your measurements actually had an impact or not. And you need to have information, first of all, to see the situation before that and after. So that information that you need for decision makers is different from the information that you will offer the general citizens. Sometimes I go through the database and I think, okay, if someone logs in to take a look at the information, will they even understand this? And this is a work that has to do with how we translate that information into indicators that can really help the citizens to know, to find out more, to follow up whether the actions of the state or of the companies are actually affecting in a positive or negative manner their own well being. Obviously, for the purpose of research, that's a different type of data. You wouldn't need the information translated in any way. You would need the raw database, but with a certain level of certainty that the information was obtained in the right manner. So I believe it's very important, and we keep saying this over and over again that the decision making is conducted in a certain manner and that the public policies are made in a certain manner that's based on scientific evidence, and without information, it's impossible to do that in the right way. Now, in terms of the environmental projects, I would like to mention two institutions that are involved. First, SENACE, which is responsible for the environmental impact assessments, and OEFA, which is responsible for the supervision, enforcement of those commitments that the companies entered into in the environmental impact assessment. The first one has to do with mitigation, and the second one has to do with the enforcement of the regulation. In the case of SENACE, it's a very young institution. It was created in 2012 with the purpose of preventing the economic sectors, the productive sectors, mining, for instance, from being a judge and an interested party because they were promoting their activities while at the same time self regulating. So there has been a process by which all the sectors are now part of SENACE, but SENACE is basically responsible for those investments that are larger projects, while the rest of the projects are still under the responsibility of the other sectors. The environmental impact assessments, and I don't expect you to read this, this is only to show you that both the environmental impact assessments as well as the modification of environmental impact assessments follow a certain time frame, and it is clearly established in terms of the due dates, the requirements, and the participation of citizens. And the fact that this agency of certification is independent, because yes, it is part of the ministry, but it is an independent entity both in terms of its decisions as well as in terms of its budget, and that gives it, of course, the possibility of being an institution in which the private sector really does trust. And they have worked a lot on achieving access to the information, in raising awareness regarding what they do. And my experience tells me that we can talk about environmental impact studies, but people don't really understand what that is all about. Usually they would just say, okay, this industry, they are wrong because they generate an impact. And the first thing that I tell them is that yes, any and every human activity has an impact over the environment. The issue is how do we mitigate that impact and how an investment puts in place the mechanisms necessary to not harm the environment and to somehow restore or mitigate for the damage that is caused. So Senase has been able to do this and they have worked a lot in terms of providing access to information, and also inclusion has been very important for them. And they even have this policy of open doors, as I call it, by which all the time they are calling the society to know more about their processes, to find out more about their work. And of course, for us, we were very interested in having this institution certified with the anti bribery ISO because we do believe that there needs to be a very high level of trust in the work that they conduct. On the other hand, OEFA is an entity that was also created 10 years ago or a little bit more. It is also part of the Ministry of Environment, but it is independent as well, and it is in charge of supervision and enforcement. But OEFA is also the guiding entity within a complex system of environmental enforcement and supervision. It is also kind of difficult to understand how it works, and it has certain levels, right? We have the level of OEFA, but there are also certain activities of enforcement, assessment, and supervision, which is under the responsibility of the economic sectors, of the regional governments, of the province governments, and of the district governments. As you can see, we have mining, energy, fishing, among others, and these are the major investments that are under the supervision of OEFA. However, there are other entities, including some economic sectors, that do carry out the supervision of other activities. For instance, the Ministry of Production is responsible for the supervision of the extraction of the fishing resources. And also, we have transport, for instance, that carries out its own enforcement duties. And at the regional government level, once again, we see mining and fishing because, without a doubt, the regional governments definitely do have a specific role to play. But that is over, for instance, artisanal mining in the case of mining, and in the case of fishing, over the extraction activities. So the system is complex, definitely, but I believe that also OEFA has put the focus on working on access to the information. And at the moment, if we were to analyze all the institutions that are involved, I believe that this is one of the few institutions that has open data in a very broad manner, in a very, I would say, friendly with the user manner, and they have conducted the work to have or to put in place actions that actually do have a positive impact over the audience, and they have raised awareness. Furthermore, the OECD conducted the first study on an institution of this type in Peru, fulfilling fulfilling the entire process that the OECD carries out to check whether this institution fulfills its duty or not. Now, moving on to the financing, these two entities are usually funded by three different sources. First, charges to the user, fines, and also resources of the public treasury. And in the case of Senasa, you will see that they have a lower budget with 35.2 million sols. That's basically public funds. Their own resources is what they charge for carrying out the assessments, which are very low. And in the case of OEFA, they do have a higher budget, they have a wider coverage, they have a budget of 250 million sols. However, the source in this case is basically the contributions via regulations. And of course, these had conflicts as well, and they have even gone to the constitutional courts because of this to check whether that contribution was valid or not. And now, to wrap up my presentation, some contributions to the roadmap. First, regarding environmental information, it needs to improve. Nowadays, we have access to the information, but we do not know whether that information is useful overall. That information needs to come not only from the environmental sector, but also from other sectors, and with that, the complexity and the difficulty increases. The information in itself is not enough. You need to work on it to be understood by the general audience. And information, it doesn't speak on its own. It needs to be put in the right context with the right analysis. And I believe that the academia should be an ally, should play a role as well with greater involvement in terms of access to information. Secondly, in my opinion, I believe that we need to know more about the institutions. We need to know what do they do, what is the scope of their work. Because in my public work, I have seen people, for instance, whenever there was an oil spillage, people would say OEFA is not doing anything because they're not putting anyone in jail whenever there was an oil spillage, and that's not the duty of OEFA. The duty of OEFA was to check that the company that had the responsibility for the operation was not guilty of being negligent to cause that leak. But if that is verified or not, that's no longer the responsibility of OEFA, that's the responsibility of the judicial power, and that's not easy to understand, and that generates ongoing tension and conflict between the institutions. And also, I like to recognize and acknowledge the progress that the institutions have made. We are tempted to talk about everything that doesn't work, and we do not acknowledge everything that does work. And I believe that these two entities, they have learned so many lessons, and they could definitely be useful for other institutions that play similar roles in Latin America. Finally, in terms of the legislation, yes, there has been progress, definitely, but I would say that if we were to allocate resources somewhere in the future, that needs to go to the implementation. I believe that in the implementation, we run into the most important barriers that prevent us from taking a leap, from going beyond, from having information which is useful, which is what we ultimately want. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elsa, and now I will be switching to English.
Thank you very much, Elsa. For sure, in a country like Peru, where the extractive sector has a key role in its economy, it's a big challenge to address all these challenges in the environmental sector. Thank you very much for your time and your comments. It was really, really exciting to hear from you this idea of excess of information and what to do with that, isn't it? Thank you. We will come again on this idea later on the Q&A session. For now, I would like to welcome again to Lisa and Boris in Berlin. Guys, you have the floor, and please, pretty excited to hear your experience in the ITI Germany and how have been dealing with these issues. Please, the floor is yours. Boris, please turn on your microphone.
Thank you very much, Victor. Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to join this very interesting webinar. I would like to start for our presentation with a short overview on the agenda. We would like to structure our presentation with 3 guiding questions. The first question we would like to ask to you is why are environmental topics specifically relevant for the German extractive industries? So a little bit on the background of environmental topics in the German extractive industries. The second aspect we would like to highlight is how did the German MSG integrate environmental topics into the EITI reporting, not only based on the new requirements of the standard, but even before, when environmental payments were not a mandatory requirement of the EITI standard. And the last point would be, why is the government supporting the integration of environmental topics in the EITI reporting? So there was strong support from all stakeholder groups to integrate environmental topics into the reporting, and we would like to highlight the point of view of the government. I start with the first point. What is the background of environmental topics in the German extractive industries? When we talk about environmental topics in the German extractive industries, it's very important to start with how is the extractive industries extracting, how is it happening? And I think it's very important to know that Germany is a very highly densely populated country. That means that extractive activities, and for Germany this is mining of coal, boring and extraction of oil and gas, onshore and offshore. These activities are happening next to urban areas, next to populations. And I would like to show you a picture that is highlighting this. Down on the left side you see a gas extraction site. And you can see very well that this gas extraction site is surrounded by agricultural land, it's surrounded by a small town and other small towns. So in Germany, extractive activities happening next to the population, they are visible, and they affect not only population but also agricultural activities, for example. That's among others, one reason why environmental topics were quite high on the agenda since the 70s, not only extractive industries, but generally in Germany. So there's a long tradition of discussing environmental topics, of people engaging, of civil society, discussing these questions. And when it comes to extractive industries, there are around these environmental topics also some conflicts. I would like to give you one recent example that maybe exemplifies why there was strong support to include environmental topics into the reporting of the EITI. A few years ago, there was a quite strong conflict between CSO organizations, local initiatives, about the non-conventional gas extraction. It's also called fracking, a technology that has been criticized, discussing environmental topics, technical risks, people environmental risks that are associated with this extraction of gas, or with this kind of extraction. And these conflicts and these ongoing discussions finally led to a moratorium for fracking projects, or for projects extracting gas with these non-conventional technologies in 2011. So this example shows that the population is, or the public is highly engaged in these questions, and that these conflicts may lead to the stop of the extraction at all. So I can say, to close this first point, that environmental concerns play a critical role for the acceptance of extractive industries among the wider population. And this was basically the starting point when in 2014 the German government decided to implement the EITI in Germany. And I would like to come to the next question. So when the implementation in Germany started, how did the EITI MSG integrate environmental topics into the EITI reporting? One of the starting points was that among the organizations present in the multi-stakeholder group on civil society side, from the beginning, there were organizations that were strongly focused on environmental topics. So there was not only on the business side and on the government side, resources and personal expertise in environmental topics, but also on the civil society side. And the whole MSG, from the beginning, regarded environmental topics as highly relevant to the EITI process. And some of you might know that in the beginning of the EITI implementation, the multi-stakeholder group has to agree on certain goals that reflect those relevant topics, that reflect the interests of the multi-stakeholder group, and that frame the implementation of the EITI. And I just want to highlight one sentence of these common goals of the German MSG that highlights this, this importance of environmental topics. The MSG says in its common goals that one of their aims is to promote a broad debate on resource policy that includes aspects of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. Coming back to the first point, how important environmental topics are for the acceptance of extractive activities in Germany. This goal highlights that the MSG wants to address these conflicts, these discussions that were already present before the EITI implementation, and that environmental topics are at the core of the goals of the MSG, how to implement the EITI. When the implementation of the EITI and the reporting process started, the MSG basically started with an idea of how to integrate environmental topics that is quite similar to the now provision of the EITI standard, which requires to include environmental payments into the reporting. So right in the beginning, the MSG take a look at the extractive industries, where are potential environmental payments are there, and how can we report about them. They looked into fields like renaturation, rehabilitation, the securities related to the compulsory renaturation of extractive sites, environmental fees, for example. But it turned out, after a few months of investigating in these fields and discussions in the multi-stakeholder group, that there are basically no extractive payments, no environmental payments in the extractive industry. So even if the MSG decided that they would like to include such payments, they found out that there are no payments that could be made transparent in the logic of the EITI in general. Next slide. In the absence of any relevant environmental payments, the MSG decided to include comprehensive and understandable contextual information on the legal framework and its implementation instead. That means that when the MSG found out that there are no payments, they go back a step and ask themselves who is the target group and what are our goals for the EITI reporting. And as I said in the beginning, environmental topics in the extractive industries affect the whole population, the whole public. So the public was taken into consideration as the main target group. And by that means, the MSG decided not to include a lot of data sets on payments, in absence of these payments, but to provide a very comprehensive, understandable overview on the legal framework and its implementation. What is the legal framework and what is the implementation? I would like to go a step back and give you an example of the German natural conservation law. And that's the reason why there are no payments. the German natural conservation law is based on a so-called processing cascade. So if any commercial activity is about to intervene into nature, the first step is try to avoid the intervention as much as possible, to minimize the intervention, and if that's not possible, as a last step, to compensate for the intervention in nature. And the last resort of this compensation measures is to compensate by a payment if a compensation measure in kind is not possible. That's the explanation why in the German extractive industries there's very, very less payments, which you might call environmental payments. So to give you an example about the size of these numbers, of these payments, the vast majority of interventions is compensated by means of compensatory substitution measures. That means in kind, renaturation of a land where former extractive activities happen. These measures are happening in kind. That means there's no payments to the government happening. To give you an example in numbers, the renaturation of an open pit mine where coal is extracted would amount to about 2 billion euros for compensation measures in kind. And the total number of compensation payments happening in the German extractive industries amounts to 1 billion euro per year. So you see, that's the reason why there aren't any substantial payments that could be reported. But there is a very complicated system instead that requests those compensatory measures from the companies. And that's why the MSG decided to explain this system to the public in terms of legal framework, to name the contacts of the institutions that implement those framework, where people can get more information about single projects, and to provide examples of these compensatory measures instead of providing any payment or numbers or data on these environmental measures in detail. So to give you, to close this point, to give you an idea what is the core of these integration of environmental topics in the German report. Instead of giving substantial amount of data that could be used to make an analysis of the environmental topics in the German extractive industries, the MSG decided to provide comprehensive, understandable information to the public that allows the public to get more information, to get informed how the system is working. And the final aim of this is, as I said in the beginning, to increase the acceptance of the extractive activities in Germany and to mitigate the conflict on these environmental topics.
Thank you very much, Boris, and hello to everyone on this webinar. I would like to add background to what Boris just said about the EITI process in Germany from the German government's perspective. First, the question is, why does the German government support the environmental reporting in the EITI context, and why was there support even before it was mandatory according to the EITI standard? So as an industry nation, an export nation, Germany is highly dependent on raw materials, and we secure our supply pretty much based on three pillars. This is first our domestic extractive sector, then it's secondary raw materials generated from recycling, and then of course the import of raw materials. The government is of course interested in supporting the German industry in securing the supply of raw materials, and this includes according to those three pillars I just mentioned, the support of our domestic extractive sector. Boris pointed out before that the sourcing of raw materials can be quite controversial, and there are quite some acceptance issues, which is especially true with regards to the fact that every mining activity does have an impact on nature, and that there's always an intervention in nature. So from the government's perspective, implementing the ITI and reporting about environmental issues that correlate with the sourcing of raw materials can increase both the acceptance, but also the understanding of our extractive sector, and thereby contribute to resolving those controversies or even to prevent them from the beginning. It is an instrument that to inform about the extractive sector, how it is managed, what its added value is, what it does for our daily lives, and how important it is for our daily lives. But also, on the other hand, and this is quite important, we also want to inform about its impacts on the environment and what is being done in order to minimize, prevent, or remedy those impacts. So the government wants to foster an informed debate about its or about resource policy, including both positive and negative aspects. We are, of course, also looking at our partner countries when it comes to achieving more transparency and accountability when it comes to raw materials. Raw materials are really important regarding the income of the state and its budgets, but also for companies, and it can contribute to a sustainable development. As a precondition, the government says that it's really necessary to responsibly and transparently manage the natural resources and to have a transparent raw materials market. International transparency initiatives such as the ITI can then help and are important instruments to accomplish that. And this is also why the German government has been an active supporter of the ITI, both financially and politically, for the last years now. Another important aspect I would like to highlight is the fact that it becomes more and more important where the raw materials that the German industry is using are actually coming from and under which circumstances they have been sourced. Both the government, but also, of course, civil society expect companies, and especially raw material importing companies, to govern their supply chains and to show good governance when it comes to raw material sourcing and along the entire supply chain pretty much. And companies are being held more and more responsible when it comes to such good governance. So this does not only include human rights and the respect of human rights, but also environmental issues, which are becoming more and more important and are being discussed in the public debate in Germany as well. So this is also a reason that we welcome that the environmental reporting is now part of the EITI standard. Thank you very much, and we are now looking forward to the debate.
Termino.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much, Boris. So such an interesting discussion. Thank you for sharing your experience. And I would like to request all the panelists to turn on your cameras so we can start with this Q&A session.
Aquí podemos tirar GC.
Very interesting questions that we have received from the many countries in the world that are watching this streaming session. First, a very interesting one. Thank you, Cristobal Girardi in Chile. How important is the participation of local community in the definition and design of the compensation programs? What are your thoughts on that? Very interesting one. Maybe Elsa, could you start, please?
Yes, sure. Very interesting question. In Peru, we don't have compensation as was talking here. What we have is a kind of negotiation that was first doing between the firms and the community. Sí. What happened with that in the spirit, and we know now that we can not continue to do that, is that because this negotiation is between these two no? And then, for example, the community want more money for letting the operation works, or demand more employment, for example, from the community in the operation, and the firm does not allow that, then a conflict arises, and then both turn on to the government and said, well, it's your problem, it's not even my problem. What happened with that is, of course, that the government have no information about what were the conditions of that negotiation before. And also, there are also many other issues not related with environmental topics, not even with the relation with the community and the firm, but for example, the total lack of investment from the government in the local community. No, there have been a loan. Usually, these places are very far, and there are very poor communities with almost no possible development for other things. So it's a major problem that doesn't going to end if we just look at that as a relationship with the firm only, no? So in that sense, the government have go into these places and try to develop a more bigger plan, a development plan, really, for communities, and that's what we try to address. The problem is that, you know, the bureaucracy is almost half its times, and the community wants solutions right now, and of course this again generates more conflicts and a lack of trust. I think that in that sense, what happened is nobody trusts anybody. They always think that you're not going to, even if you sign, no, you have the picture, you sign, you need an act, no, official, with a lot of things. You don't trust the others. So always this is very, very difficult to do.
Thank you. Salim, maybe you have some experience or thoughts in that question?
In terms of compensation, of course, the community's role is going to be important, but the challenge is that there is, you know, whenever you have any kind of inequality, deep inequality, as we often do in Latin America, there is going to be a sense that you try to get the maximum without necessarily considering the technical implications. And that can lead to impasse, it can lead to more conflict. So I personally think that there needs to be very clear government guidelines, further refined, about what kind of compensation should be presented for land acquisitions, easements, and so on. There is the other sort of compensation which comes after environmental disasters or some kind of accidents, and that's a different story. So, you know, for that, there are many other models of what should be done. In fact, I'm working on a paper right now which looks at the compensation that was put forward after the Samarco disaster in Brazil. And in that case, the Brazilian government set up a whole foundation to try work with the community to figure out the compensation model, because there were 700 kilometers of impacts down the river. And it was, unfortunately, even though they involved the community, it became very acrimonious because just the involvement delayed the compensation. So they spent $1 billion in the whole process, but because the involvement delayed everything, it was not as successful as you would have hoped. So when they had the second disaster with the Bromedinho case just 2 years ago, they didn't use that model. Instead, they went directly to the families, and Vale negotiated individually with each family the compensation so that they would get it faster. So it's a very delicate balance, especially in those cases.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Boris and Lisa, what about this situation in a highly populated country like Germany and with strong organization at the civil level?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I have to admit that I'm not an expert on these environmental compensatory measures, but as far as we learned in the ITI process, this compensation as a second step after avoidance or minimizing the intervention of human nature, this compensation is from the governance point of view, a very technical process in the beginning. So if you, for example, build a mine, then in your plan how you would like to build the mine, you have to include a so-called landscape management plan. Lists all your interventions, which maybe is like a euphemism, hectares of woods. And within this management plan, you have, and that's what I meant by technical process, you then have to lay down how you compensate for the destruction of 500 hectares of woods, which maybe is to rebuild the wood at another place, for example. So this is a very technical process. There is involvement of local communities, of local organizations, and I would like to highlight two aspects in this involvement. The first thing is that they are involved in the whole political decision on this. So there's a consultation process, and this is more to inform the population. And this leads to the point I've talked about before, about we talked about before, the acceptance of the extractive projects in the population. Because the population gets informed what is happening in their neighborhood. They get informed about the compensatory measures, and they get informed how the landscape would look like after the mine is closed. That doesn't mean that they accept everything that is planned, but at least they have comprehensive information on what is going to happen. And this leads a long time into the future. So they get informed what is happening in 25 or 30 years, and this part or this region. The second aspect is that there is, when it comes to these compensatory measures, of course, they are technical in nature. That you have, when you say you compensate, you have to try to get an equal level after the mine is closed in terms of nature of landscape. But of course, there's some options on which you can decide, and these options. So, what is going to be rebuilt after the mine is closed? This not only involves the opinion of the people that live around this mine, but also leads to or is directed towards a transformational process in terms of what is going to happen in economic terms when the mine is closed, because people are still there, they lose their jobs if the mine is closed. So in Germany, some of these compensatory measures include or adjust the starting point of this transformation process. For example, many of the big open pit mines are renaturated to a lake, and this lake then may be a recreational place where people have jobs in terms of tourism industry. So this is, people are involved, there's a political process, but the compensatory measures as such in the beginning are a very technical process.
Thank you very much. Second questions, really interesting ones. Thank you very much for that. I will try to translate it because it came in Spanish. In the framework of transparency, what to do when a project is an idea and is projected to be developed, and the technical arguments are strong in environmental point of view, but there are the opposition of some other stakeholders that are against, but maybe with not all the information in mind. How to address this situation, and how to use the transparency as a tool to have a technical debate.
Yes, I think this is a key issue, is that transparency is not necessarily going to resolve conflicts. The transparency is meant to make sure that the process is, but it's quite possible that there are some stakeholders for whom there is no negotiable outcome. So there are always going to be certain activists, certain community members for values that no matter what, whether they have less information or more information, they're going to oppose a project. So what you really need is a good mediator who is able to consider the information and see what are the limits to which you can bring people together. Those who are not going to reach consensus, they can litigate. The legal option is usually always there. But if you try to bring in many times those parties who have absolutely nothing to gain from a negotiated outcome, they will just spoil the process. So I think it's very important for a good mediator to be able to distinguish between those and see what are the places where you can actually have consensus. So transparency is not going to necessarily help in that way if people are just against it, but it is going to make the process fairer, and it's going to make sure that the expectations are managed better so that people know what they're getting into. But the other thing with transparency that's important is you want to make sure uncertainty is also clear to the people, because science is not an absolute measure in most cases. Science is always socially constructed to some extent, and to just say that we have all the information, we have all the studies, you will have scientists who say one thing, other scientists who say other thing. You try to bring in the right process. You share the peer-reviewed papers. You say, well, this quality of science is better. You inform the public about why it is there. But there will always be limits to that. So, for example, with uranium mining, there are people who are opposed to uranium mining because they're against nuclear. As we know, in Germany, there are plenty of such good people. But there are also a lot of people who think nuclear is the only way you can solve the carbon crisis. So, that is a value-based judgment. And no matter what information you place to them, they are going to take it either way. So I think a good mediator is really important.
I would totally agree with Salim, and also I would said that I think that maybe we need to do prevention actions, no? Because sometimes there is a misunderstanding. For example, here in mining sector, our soil it has a lot of minerals. Even if there's no an operation, a specific operation in a community, the water, for example, have a lot of minerals, no? But when an operation came into place, then all the minerals in the water is because the contamination, the pollution of the firm, and that's most of the cases is not real, and get a lot of confusion, no misunderstandings, and end in a conflict, no. But so I think that, for example, the agency of supervision and fiscalization that I was talking about have a prevention actions in different communities, not even in the ones that is in an operation in place yet. They start getting the numbers, the state of the environment, of the soil, of the water, of the air, with the community. No, the participation in the community in getting those numbers to see what is the state of the environment. Even in 3 years, there were no operation in place there. So I think that get a lot of knowledge for the community also, to see if it's a matter of an operation that don't have clear standards, don't follow standards, or is a matter of the nature, really, no? So I think that the prevention is also a key for trying to get more transparency and avoid conflicts.
Thank you, Elsa. Some comments from Germany?
Yeah, so maybe we totally agree with what has been said so far, and I think it's really important that the information is giving proactively to the local communities and to people that are interested in what is going on and what the project is going to do to the environment, for example. So this is maybe a first step to get more transparency and information to the people even before the actual approval process starts, where people or the public is informed anyway, so start earlier. And then also to have a transparent monitoring process during the whole project to show people that what has been promised in the beginning is actually being done. And maybe Boris has an example for that.
Yeah, an example from the German oil and gas industry. In our presentation, we showed a picture that these oil and gas extraction fields are quite closely located to urban areas. And one concern of many local communities was that there are local earthquakes that are caused by the oil and gas extraction. And the oil and gas industry now has made online a map, a real-time map showing any earthquake event or near earthquake event happening in Germany with a time code. When did this happen? How strong was the earthquake? So it is, in the end, it's not the website or this map is not preventing the earthquakes, but it's a clear statement that they address the concerns. They make it transparent. People can address things that happen, and you can have this monitoring for other things as well, as the example with polluted rivers, for example. You can have a monitoring of pollution of rivers, or a real-time monitoring, or a frequent monitoring. And I think that these things both go together. The first thing is proactive information before the project starts, transparent about techniques that are used, about management plans, about renaturation plans, compensatory plans, and a proactive and transparent monitoring of these aspects that are of concern to the population.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of questions, but I will try to resume some of them. Related with we have spoken lastly, which you consider are the key sustainable indicators, the basic ones that should have a good system of environmental information. Thank you, Mr. Mejia from Mexico.
So the environmental indicators, they're talking about water quality, air quality, or there are indices which have been developed around environmental performance, both at the country level and at the corporate level. That's why I gave them the suggestion that they look at the Global Reporting Initiative, because under the GRI, there are different kinds of categories of environmental indicators that companies report. If they want to look at national level, there is the environmental performance, which is published by Yale University every year. And that has a lot of indicators which they measure at the country. The same indicators could be used also at the local level and at the level, and those have to do with water, air, biodiversity, and so on, and how they are measured. So I mean, the key challenge is you have to have good data, and you have to make sure that it is up, and that's why using existing metrics and indicators is the best way to go.
I will add that maybe if we have to set that what are the most important, I think that the ones that are related with the health, no, with the population health are the most important. Water, for example, is completely a key issue only for now in the pandemic, and also before. I think the access to water and the water pollution is very important for health and for well-being, really. Air pollution is also very important and have a lot of impact in people's wealth. So I will go for those two if we have to address two, but I mean there are so many indicators that can be used for that. But these are the main things.
Thank you, Elsa. Lisa or Boris?
Yes, so I think it's important to have information about the impact on water, the nature surrounding a project, noise, air. So what is happening to all that, and also it's important to know what kind of accidents could happen. Or earthquakes, like I mentioned before, but it's also like what if something happens to something breaks down. So what does that mean for the local community living around a project? So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're almost running out of time, but there's a direct question to the EITI group in Germany. What mechanisms are used by you to socialize and communicate with the communities the information that is reported in the EITI framework?
Thank you very much. This is indeed a very good question, and is a constant effort. We invest a lot of resources at the Secretariat because it's not that easy to get to the people. The starting point for the DITI was to ask civil society and to support civil society that civil society organizations present in the MSG use their network to promote the EITI, to promote the reporting, but not as a one-way process, but also to get a feedback from these other organizations, among them local organizations, what kind of information they're interested in, if they agree with the things that are reported. So this is at least the ideal was to have an exchange between those local communities and the multi-stakeholder group, and that this exchange is facilitated by the organizations, the civil society organizations present. But of course, we have a communication strategy that also tries to use other channels, that is social media, that is printing handout materials, that is a website. And last but not least, that is the concept of the reporting platform. So, as like many other EITI countries, we do not only have a written report, but a platform, a website. And the design of the website was specifically adjusted to the target group of, let's say, local populations, in terms of having a website that is easily accessible, easily understandable, providing comprehensive, understandable information, that is specifically directed to, for example, people on the local level that are maybe not extractive experts or not experts in extractive governance, but people that live next to extraction sites, and to provide them with information that allows them to have a starting point, to get more information, to inform themselves in a manner that is easily understandable, easily accessible. So that was basically the two ways: a channel via the CSO network and a website that has a specific target group, or was designed to a specific target group.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Elsa, Lisa, Boris, Salim, thank you very much. It was a really exciting discussion. Thanks for sharing with us your experiences and your thoughts. And well, have a nice day. I have shared with all the audience the materials that have been presented in this webinar. Please feel free to download it and to study it. And this webinar series continues in 2 weeks. We meet again to discuss about discussions around the extractive industry at the subnational level. So we will have again a really exciting panel, and we hope to see you there. Thank you very much to all of you, and see you in 2 weeks. Have a nice day, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Transparencia en la información ambiental en el sector extractivo. Una de las principales preocupaciones alrededor de la explotación de recursos naturales y particularmente alrededor de la explotación de minerales e hidrocarburos se centra en los impactos de esta explotación en el medio ambiente. A lo largo de las diferentes etapas de desarrollo de los proyectos y luego en la cadena de producción, se deben observar estándares ambientales rigurosos que garanticen que los impactos son apropiadamente afrontados. Para garantizar la implementación de medidas de mitigación y compensación efectivas, los Estados han establecido requisitos e instrumentos que todo proyecto extractivo debe cumplir para poder operar. En los primeros se pueden mencionar los estudios de impacto ambiental, mientras que en los segundos se han definido algunos pagos relacionados con el manejo ambiental en las operaciones extractivas. Conozcamos las experiencias de algunos países y escuchemos cómo han integrado estas discusiones sobre la transparencia en la información ambiental en el sector extractivo. ¿Qué tipo de instrumentos y permisos ambientales debe cumplir un proyecto para poder operar? ¿Cómo se gestionan e implementan estos instrumentos o permisos? ¿Generan pagos que recauden las entidades estatales? ¿La información sobre estos pagos es transparente y accesible? ¿Cómo se han integrado estos temas en los grupos multiactor? Con el apoyo de Cooperación Alemana, GIZ, EIT Colombia, EIT Perú,